lesser ratio between men who are positive and women who are HIV positive in the South than the rest of the region. And there's also a challenge with the level of poverty and lack of access to education, lack of resources that come into the South or that are generated in the South, predominantly placed by politics and ideology within the policymakers, that we are in a situation where we look a whole lot like the global South. And so what are some of those particular intersections there? So if we have broken down what I would call Western supremacy, and we recognize that obviously violence is upheld and perpetuated by the fact that male supremacy exists, lives live and well, and that many of us buy into it, that if we're accepting in that, then the issue of white supremacy is not that hard to grasp. The issue of internalizing the racism that we have is not that far from that same kind of understanding. That if through a culture and tradition I come from, I even know who my people were on the plantations, right? I know who the slave master was because he happens to now be my great-great-great-great-grandfather. And I'm sure my great-great-great-great-grandmother was not necessarily complicit, right? So if we have some of that understanding, and we know that the white supremacy itself is also not just a system of how we have treated each other, but that it is also considered a part of our culture and tradition, then we end up being complicit in some of our own oppression. And I think that that is a part of the conversation that we rarely have when we're talking about the vulnerabilities of women when it comes to HIV and violence at that particular intersection. And that's what I meant by coming back to that conversation that we haven't talked about, because in the black community and for black women in the United States, one of the key drivers for why our epidemic looks so much worse than everyone else's is because our men also occupy a disproportionate amount of the HIV epidemic, whether they are gay, bisexual, or heterosexual. It's just that the challenge of heteronormativity and homophobia and all of that really deny us the opportunity to focus in on men who have sex with women in the epidemic and how their behaviors around violence, substance abuse, and engaging in their own sense of identity in a white supremacist country, how that all plays out in their own risk behaviors and vulnerabilities with regard to HIV. And so if we understand that, then we know now if the concentration of the epidemic is in black men and in black women, we also know for a fact that black women, unlike all of the other women in the United States, are more likely to only have relationships with people within their own race. Black women, more than anyone else, are more likely to only get into relationships with black men in our lifetime. Then we already have a natural built-in vulnerability because the pool or the concentration of the epidemic is already in our communities. And that's what it means when we say a black woman can have one relationship for all of her life and still be at greater risk for HIV and even possibly for violence than the white counterparts would be if they had 20 to 25 relationships in one lifetime. So if we just, draw the lens back and kind of take a look at all of this, it sort of helps answer when every time somebody asks me, well, what is it about black women that is driving the epidemic? And these are what they are. That we also know that where human rights protections are available the least to people, that's where the most HIV, substance abuse, and violence exists. Because it goes hand in hand with if you don't have access to employment, if you're overly incarcerated, I don't know if people know that stat, that the United States, of course, incarcerates more people than all of Europe put together, if not the rest of the world. We have over 2 million people languishing in jails and prisons, 60 to 70% of which are nonviolent crimes for 25 years to life sometimes. And that 70% of those people in the prisons are black men and men of color. then you're removing a part of our community, separating that away from our capacity to build strong families, to support the economic growth in particular communities, to have greater political voice, vote, and representation. So all of those things that target black men, by and large, indirectly and directly, create more vulnerabilities for black women and other women of color. And I don't think we have enough of those conversations to figure out how to respond structurally to HIV prevention and increasing access to treatment and care in communities that are under-resourced, just like in the Global South, because we're only still, even now, focusing on the transmission of HIV or the vulnerabilities to violence to be solely based on individual behaviors and personal responsibility. And if we cannot look at it structurally, then we will not ever get to the end of protecting women from violence or from HIV.